Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House online. I'm Christina and I'm the director here. And on behalf of the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand is the traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. We'd also like to thank our season sponsors for the After Uncle Tom's Cabin Black Voices for Justice series, and those are School Outfitters and Hindman Auctions. And information about both of them are linked on our website. And I also wanted to briefly mention all of the upcoming events because for some reason it's October and we haven't slowed down. So we are doing a teen writing program in conjunction with Wordplay. And that starts, it's like kind of centered in Walnut Hills, and that will start next Monday. It will run Mondays, October 11th through November 15th at 4 p.m. and last for an hour each day. Part of that will be walking tours of Walnut Hills. And to get to that registration, you would go to the Wordplay website. We also are going to do some outreach activities at the Walnut Hills Street Food Festival this Saturday. So we'll be there from 3 to 7 in the old Kroger parking lot. We have a suffrage walking tour planned because we're getting ready for election season again. And that will take place on October 16th at 1 p.m. So you can get registered for that through the website as well. We have a lecture on October 17th. I didn't write the whole title down, but it's about river stories and maternal ambition on the Ohio River. So the picture included a picture of Eliza, and that is a professor from the University of Louisville, Susan Ryan, who's presenting that with us. There is an in-house and online option for that. The October Semicolon Club, which will be October 23rd at noon on Zoom, is the novel Beloved, and that discussion leader is our very own Dr. Getz. And for anybody who wants to participate in a great volunteer activity, we are doing the Flying Pig Half Marathon Orange Station again this year, and that is on October 31st. Yes, it's Halloween, but it's in the morning, so you got to get here at like 6:30 or so, and we'll be cutting up and distributing oranges to the runners as they go by. We've also started a program where we're offering yoga on the lawn, and that is our instructor is our volunteer CJ Pierce, and she's doing it Wednesday 6 p.m. and Saturdays 10 a.m. weather permitting. So we're going to try it and see how it goes, but yoga on the lawn. All right, so tonight's discussion leaders are Dr. Deshawn Battle, who will be joining us after her class ends at 7:15, and Dr. John Getz, both of them from Xavier University. So let's get started.
Okay, thanks for the happy few of you who are here. Yeah, let's talk about the timeline for Alice Walker's life. Born in 1944 to sharecropper parents, black sharecropper parents in Eatonton, Georgia, small town. Here comes the timeline on screen for you. Eatonton, Georgia is also the birthplace of Joel Chandler Harris, who's the author of the Uncle Remus stories that we've seen kind of made fun of to some extent or gone undercut a little bit by Charles Chestnut in some of his writings. It's significant in this case because for Alice Walker, because she has a childhood memory of a restaurant in Eatonton, Georgia that had an Uncle Remus figure, a stuffed dummy claiming to be Uncle Remus, who's a fictional character, couldn't have been the real person, in the window. And it was a restaurant that was for whites only. So if you read the readings from tonight, you may see a connection with one of those stories. Her maternal grandmother was, her maternal great-grandmother was African and Cherokee, and Walker's work often shows an interest in Native American cultures because of that. Her mother was very supportive of her getting a good education. And besides working in the fields as a sharecropper, she also worked as a seamstress, and you learn more about her also in Search of Our Mother's Gardens. So she goes to Spelman College, Alice Walker does, for a couple of years, leaves there when her mentor, Howard Zinn, who was a revisionist historian. Some of you would know him as the author of A People's History of the United States. He hadn't written it yet when he was at Spelman. He was a young World War II vet, starting his teaching career there. He got fired, and she was upset about that, and transferred to Sarah Lawrence in New York, where she was one of only 3 Black students. She did meet Martin Luther King at Spelman, and that had a big impact on her. She also visited Africa, and in senior year, she met Langston Hughes, another connection with our earlier work here, in these earlier discussions, who publishes her first short story and becomes a kind of mentor to her, not so much giving her pointers on her writing, but just the encouragement, taking notice of her, championing her work, and encouraging her. She's early involved in the civil rights movement. In 1967, marries Mel Leventhal, a white civil rights lawyer. She consciously does not change her last name when she gets married. It's partly as a tribute to her great-great-grandmother, Mary Poole, who as an enslaved person walked all the way from Virginia to Georgia, supposedly with a baby on each hip. So Walker seemed like an appropriate name to her to hang on to. That the combination of Alice Walker also reminded her of Sojourner Truth, of that name, Walker, Sojourner, and then Alice she associates with Elethia, the Greek goddess of truth or disclosure. She starts publishing soon after that. Her first book of poems, which she wrote in her last 2 years of college. We could all wish we were that productive. Comes out a year after, when she's a year out of school. She has a daughter, Rebecca, who becomes a feminist in later years. Sometimes a conflicted relationship with her mother, Alice, but they seem to be reconciled these days. At least that's the last I've heard of that relationship. Publishes her first novel, The Third Life of Grange Copeland, and then Everyday Use, one of the stories that you read for tonight, she writes in 1973. And it's published then. In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, the essay you read tonight, written the next year, and would become the title essay in a collection she would publish back in 1983. She also published, she's been very important in American literary history and championing the work of Zora Neale Hurston, a then neglected Black American writer, known probably to some of you for Their Eyes Were Watching God, but she was also an anthropologist, did a lot of work on all sorts of folk tales and voodoo, many things. This was published in Ms. Magazine, and Walker was involved as an editor of Ms. Magazine for a while, worked with Gloria Steinem there, eventually resigned because she thought there was not enough coverage of Black women in the magazine. 1976, she writes Meridian, a novel that draws in her experience in the civil rights movement, and I think a novel that deserves more attention than it gets. I taught it a couple of times. It's well worth your time. Complex in form, kind of challenging in that respect, but well worth it as a very balanced, clear-eyed look at the role of women within the civil rights movement. It's fiction, but there are autobiographical elements to it. Elethia, the short story that you read, was published in 1981 and shows up in a collection there. The big book that she's known for, that probably all of you have read at one time or another, The Color Purple, comes out in 1982. So the Walker we're looking at tonight is really the Alice Walker of the 1970s and 1980s. And those are the works for which she is best known. Her collection, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, womanist prose, That collection comes out in 1983. I could define the term womanist. I'll give you her definition of it briefly. That's a term that she came up with, created as something that she preferred to the term feminist, because it took more note of the role of Black women in the women's movement. She says, womanist, the first definition, a Black feminist or feminist of color. And then she says, also a woman who loves other women sexually and or non-sexually, who appreciates and prefers women's culture and emotional flexibility. There's more to it, but that gives you the idea of why she invented the term. Most of you have probably seen the movie. Starting in the early 2000s, she becomes particularly active in the causes of peace, gets arrested on the eve of the Iraq War in a protest, and sadly, in the past 10 years or so, has come out with some anti-Semitic statements. She's been for quite a while an opponent of Israeli policy toward the Palestinians, but somehow it's crossed a line from that into endorsing some work by an anti-Semitic, just crazy writer, David Icke. She, if you look on our website, there's still a reference to him on there. But she is an active blogger these days, commenting on all sorts of things. And so you can check out her website if you want to see what she's up to. There are other thoughts about the biography. All right, let's get into the questions that I asked you to think about. But I have a question for the group, small group that it is, a small sample. But how many of you could name 2 Black women authors that you studied in school? Can anybody name 2 Black women authors that you studied in school?
Oh, not at school. No.
I think we studied Zora Neale Hurston and Maya Angelou.
Okay, that's good.
I would say definitely Zora Neale Hurston and Toni Morrison.
Okay.
I would say definitely no Black African-American women writers, and I was an English major.
Well, that would have been true for my experience as well.
None.
A couple of you are significantly younger than we are.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's a good sign. It reflects a change in the curriculum. But for years, I would ask students this question, and generally, I got the either 0, or once in a while, somebody would come up with 1 Black woman writer. But I'm glad to see that things have changed a little bit over the years.
John, I would say that I didn't study up through high school any Black writers, whether they were male or female.
Well, that would match my experience as well. Hey, there's ShaDawn. Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Hey.
Hi.
Thank you for waiting on me.
We're just getting into talking about the first question. And I can say that going all the way through to a PhD in English with a concentration in American Lit, 19th century, and a minor field in 20th century, I read a grand total of 1 Black American writer all the way through my education. I got my PhD in 1977. The only Black writer that I read for course material was Ralph Ellison for Invisible Man. And the teacher didn't even bother to prepare class that week. He just came in and gave us a lecture he said, I'm too busy, I'm indexing a book, so here's my lecture on Jewish American fiction. And poor Ralph Ellison was never even discussed, even though it's one of the great American novels. But so that's my experience. And that gives you a little groundwork for what Alice Walker is talking about when she said there seemed to be no Black women authors or even Black women artists to her when she was growing up. She and I are almost exactly the same age. She's a year older than I am, but so our reading experiences would have been somewhat similar. So her solution to this is well, the writers have been there all along. We just didn't know how to look for them. We've constantly looked high when we should have looked high and low. In other words, we need to broaden our standards. So I guess my question to you for discussion is she right? Should we broaden our standards to take in more writers, or is that lowering our standards?
Well, considering that we've been driven for centuries, well, the centuries of American literature and even before that by dominance of male writers, and even, white women writers were denigrated to second or third or even fifth-rate writers when they were absolutely excellent, and Harriet Beecher Stowe being one of those people. Then certainly Alice Walker's point about looking high and looking low and elevating many of these excellent, insightful, soulful people, in particular African-American women who have contributed a lot but who are unknown and unrecognized, is very legitimate, very legitimate. I even reading I was able to read two of her three, two of the three selections, and I thought, who? She named, half a dozen African-American writers, and to me it was like, well, I never heard of that one. Oh, that's a new one. Oh, that one too. And just, I've got this list. I'm like, okay, I guess I better start reading some of these people. So yeah, I don't know if I exactly answered your question, but I think I addressed it, did I not?
Yeah, and I think she makes her point very effectively in the essay by mentioning a lot of those names that large numbers of people in the audience wouldn't necessarily know about.
I don't think it's digging down or necessarily broadening either. Like, I think it's just like you're talking about good writing, and they are good writers. And I think a lot of times, well, what comes to mind actually is American History X, the conversation where they have at the kitchen table and the dad's like, well, but your English teacher is now going to have you reading these Black authors, but what about all the people that they're getting rid of now? Like, who's to say they're not very good? And I think like that is almost like the conversation of they're not second rate, and it's not like we're really changing our standards. It's just that we are actually opening our eyes to the people who are still writing at the same standard, if not even better. And I think we've had our eyes kind of closed, and like we've had blinders on to only look at a certain selection.
This kind of evokes the tension between County Cullen, and it would have been, I want to say, was it Hughes? No, it would have been County Cullen and Claude McKay, right? And so, Claude McKay says during the Harlem Renaissance, or was it? Yeah, Claude McKay says, right, like, or is it? Hold on, the Negro artist and the racial no, that would have been Langston Hughes, right? So he says, right, I feel a great deal of disdain for a particular Negro poet who says that he only wants to be identified as a poet, right? And I took that to mean, and arguably, like if you teach argumentation, right, you can say that's a bunch of slippery slopes. But like he said, I took that to mean I don't want to be identified as a Negro poet. I want to be a Negro poet, and which means I want to be white, right? But for County Cullen, his thing was, well, how do I become? How does my writing become perceived in this really transcendent way, right? And so if I label it as Negro poetry, then that means that adjective ascribes a certain level of artistry or lack thereof. And for him, right, he was really trying to avoid that stigma. But for other folks, right, during the Harlem Renaissance in particular, they were like, listen, we need to write about the ordinariness of Negro life, right? That is the racial mountain that confronts us. And so I think for Walker, what she's essentially arguing is that that Black women writers, Black women who were writing, and other artists, Black artists, right, who were using this notion of bricolage, right, as artistry, like building things from nothing, creating art out of the abstract, and really like the throwaways around them, right? So that becomes a means of representing their everyday life, their material realities, right? And that in and of itself is art. And that in and of itself also allows us to make this argument about the advancement of the Negro, right? In terms of their artistic abilities and capabilities.
Dr. Battle, I was fortunate to read these three readings in the order they were presented. And I thought that there was a wonderful connection between the first reading, the description of art in Black artists, and the second reading where art is being defined with the quilts. The quilts are not art in one case, in another case they are art. One case they're a practical manner that has a historical feature to it, and then they're being also just taken as now they have become art, and I want to display them as art. I thought that her essay, and I'm sure, and that essay and the connection with what the quilt stood for was very noteworthy.
Thank you. And it's okay if I call you Dan?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, y'all can call me ShaDawn. I'm technically off work today.
You may not know, but I'm a professor emeritus. So yeah,
oh.
call me Dan.
Hi Dan. Yeah, and call me ShaDawn. No, that's a very good point, right? And I think I would follow up by saying, again, this reminds me a lot of the argument that's made during the Harlem Renaissance movement about art for art's sake versus propagandistic art, right? But art for art's sake, if we think about the time that Alice Walker is writing, so she's writing, this particular piece, what is, you all already went through the timeline, what is it, the 70, everyday use is 73, is it? I think it's 73. So it's, the Black Power movement is waning, right? But folks are still turning toward Africa for their political impetus, their artistic resources, etc. She herself visited Africa and she took note. She writes in one of the poems in In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, right, of her time in Africa. And like she writes poetically about a village man massaging, her feet, and just the artistic, I think, just how how her art was shaped by that particular trip, right? But in Africa, that particular tradition, art for art's sake, is sort of antithetical, right? Art oftentimes has a very functional capacity, right, in an African tradition. And she's writing at the end of the Black Power movement, and much of the art that emerges in the Black arts movement during this period is very Afrocentric, right? So I would wonder then, if that is the case, would she make the argument for the quilts to be, put to everyday use, right? If she's trying to situate this argument, this idea of quilting within an Afrocentric tradition. And I think I'm getting us off track here, but I can.
No, that's good. I think we should move on to that very question.
Well, one thing I was going to say is that when I was reading the question and kind of reading through things, I wasn't looking at just writing. I was looking at kind of art in general. And I'm not sure if it was meant to be that way, but I was thinking, like bigger questions of art. And it really kind of went back to something that I used to teach in American history about, like the idea of high culture versus low culture. And this idea of, high culture are things like the opera and going to see the symphony and those type of things. Whereas low culture would be, rap and jazz. So those are musical equivalents. But when you look at it in terms of artistic things, is that, the art the high art would be, you know, paintings and sculptures, and low art would be fiber arts like quilts. And so I was looking at it in terms of, we need to look not just at what society has deemed as this is the high art, but we need to look at art in all of its forms. And there are a lot of amazing artists that are not getting recognized as artists because that's not what the high culture art is.
Yeah.
We need to
Yeah.
broaden our view of it that way.
Yeah, no, because if we don't, we just continue to like replicate these social hierarchies, right? I didn't tell John this, but so I'm working on this documentary on this art form that I grew up doing in Chicago. I'm from Chicago. It's a global art form now, but it's endemic to underrepresented communities, right, on the south and west sides of Chicago, these really silo communities, right? Chicago is one of the most segregated cities in the world. And so we created this art form, and the music is at 160 beats per minute, right? So it's really, really fast. And for me, the music corresponds to this really fast-paced life that we have to live, right? And, you know, like Black childhood is this really precarious thing in Chicago. You grow up fast. So anyway, so it's a community, but it's also an art form. It's called Chicago Footwork. And recently I'm writing a book on it. I'm doing a documentary on it, but I've had a number of different invitations to like really like prestigious places to talk about Chicago footwork. And one of the things I say in my talk is that, you know, it's an art form that, you know, it's our incubators have not been these sort of venerable institutions like a Juilliard or Xavier, right? I just recently presented at UMass Amherst, right? Now what I tell them is that, you know, it was something that was cultivated in these back alley spaces, and these dilapidated storefronts, right? And our drabs, rundown skating rinks, right? So all these places that we had to create for ourselves, right? We had to create spaces of belonging for ourselves because of these exclusionary structures in Chicago. But now, as a practitioner and a cultural critic, and who's speaking in these sort of places of higher learning, right, with the best of minds, right, it's almost as if it feels out of place. I'll say that, right, to use all of these academic terms to make it digestible for an academic audience. So I think what ends up happening is when you situate low art, quote unquote low art, right, in these sort of high art venues, that art form can oftentimes face a credibility deficit, right? In the sense that it's only digestible if you're using the language of the power structure to unpack it, right? So I think that is also the challenge of quote unquote low art, rendering it intelligible.
But I think we're a lot more open to that now than we were back in the 1970s when she was writing that essay. I think we've reckoned, well, Bob Dylan won a Nobel Prize, right? And that would have been unthinkable back then. So I think we've opened our eyes. So I think she's been successful, she and lots of other people, in trying to open the eyes of the critical establishment to a variety of so-called lower forms.
Yeah. I'd like to know though, what do you all think about, you know, whether or not she makes the right choice, right, as an author of everyday use for Mama to give the quilts to Maggie? Should the quilts have gone to D/Wangero? It's always, I just never know what to call her. I think it's a political choice, right? Whatever you decide is a very political choice. But yeah, does she make the right choice?
Wow, I say that the end of that story, when D turns to her and says, "You don't understand our heritage," is like the biggest insult I could ever imagine. Here's a beautiful art piece that has been passed down through their heritage, and now her mother is being insulted because you don't understand our heritage. These are pieces of art you have to hang. Yeah, I think her mother made the absolutely right decision. Absolutely.
Everybody does.
I struggle with like having stuff from my grandparents and my great grandparents and trying to like keep them. Like I have a quilt at home that we don't use because my kids will tear it up. Like there's no way. but I want to use it at some point, but I want them to be old enough to realize that it's not, you know, something to tear up. Like it's something it means something to me. And so I think that for sure, I agree that she made the right choice, because I don't think that her other daughter, she was going to hang it up, but she doesn't even understand. Like she doesn't understand the heritage. Like she's just treating it like something different. Like she made me mad the whole way through it. Like, because she has no respect for her mom or the actual heritage or culture. And so, yes, I agree. I don't know if you disagree the way you asked that, if we all agree with that or not, but I mean, there is that tension of like trying to protect something that is meaningful, but more because of the family connection, not because somebody made it a long time ago, but the family.
Yeah. No, I think both of you are right in the sense that, you know, many critics have argued that heritage, right, has to be continually renewed, right? And to do that, you have to be able to embody tradition. And Maggie can recreate the quilts, right? Because she knows that. But then also the most common reading is to understand Dee as manipulative and condescending, right? I don't think that you all are far adrift. But I oftentimes assign a particular reading that forces students to at least consider Dee's redemptive qualities. So I wonder what you all think, and whether or not you think there's any redemption or a counter reading possible, and what that might look like or consist of.
Well, in one way, Dee, or Wangero, as she calls herself, was really kind of taking the stand that we have to be proud of our heritage and we have to display that as a work of art. And so I think that that is important. It reminded me of, I used to, when I taught high school history, I taught like, I don't remember if I showed this movie in an African-American history class or in a cultural history class, I just don't remember. But I used to show the film called The Butler, and about the person who worked at the White House as a butler. And it reminded me of the scene where one of the sons brought home his girlfriend who was like really in the Black Power movement. And she's like, we've got to take back, and we've got to make sure that we're, you know, honoring our heritage and so forth. That's who that character reminded me of, or vice versa. And so, you know, I think that that is an important redemptive quality, but I think she was going about it wrong, because her mom and her sister did understand the heritage because they had been living it the whole time. And it wasn't like, so that's, yeah, there you go. I don't know if I have any more.
No, that's a good point.
So I looked at her as less interested in her heritage and more interested in decorating her apartment for two things. One, the first thing she does when she arrives is she takes a Polaroid out and she takes pictures of the dilapidated house. And she doesn't give them to her mother. She keeps them so she can show them off somehow to say, look where I came from, and decorate my house with it. The second thing is, while they're there, before she even gets into the quilts, they find a butter churn. And they say, oh, wow, that would look good if we polished it all up and put it in the middle, in the corner of the room, wouldn't it? Then she gets to the quilts. So I looked at her as being a very selfish individual that was more interested in demonstrating to other people how beautiful her apartment could look, and reflecting African-American heritage, and instead of really being involved with her African-American heritage. So
yeah. Walker's, I think through Dee becomes this sort of metonymic representation of what was happening during the Black Power movement, right? And so this sort of this common paradigm of turning toward Africa for our influences and as a means to redefining what it means to be Black. And consequently, in doing so, you sort of erode any immediate heritage, right? Any immediate like familial African-American traditions, you know, that emanate from, this system of the institution of chattel slavery, right? So how your ancestors, all the resistive tactics that your ancestors used to survive, right? Such a dehumanizing institution. And so what's interesting though is that in changing her name, she sort of dissociates herself from that immediate familial tradition and heritage, right? And what ends up happening is that there's this sort of disconnect between, because her mom can't even pronounce her name. So the irony is that what we saw was this sort of transcontinental natal alienation, right, with the transatlantic slave trade, and folks are trying to turn back to Africa. But in changing your name, we see another metaphoric natal alienation, because your mother cannot, communicate with you because she doesn't have access to, right, this African name, right, that you've given yourself. There are a lot of complexities, right? It's layered in complexities. I think what she's doing is satirizing, right, all these different tactics of resistance and knowing oneself. And she's suggesting that compromise, right, is always the solution. Because her mom is like, well, I'll learn that name. And she's like, well, it's okay. You can just call me D if you don't understand it, or if you can't pronounce it, right? But you're right about the house. What's interesting is that she has this big fancy camera, and she not only captures the house, but she makes sure that the cow is there too. So she really wants to highlight her agrarian, right, impoverished roots, and how far she's come from those roots.
Yeah, if I can add, the story begins in the very first line about how very proud they are to be able to go out to their sort of dilapidated porch that has got a clean floor, and they're going to spend the morning out there, together, the mother and daughter, and they're proud of that. That's how it starts off. And then Dee pulls up in her car. So they have a pride that's there that starts off the story that is just totally destroyed by Dee.
Yeah, good point. It is, but I mean, again, like some critics have said, well, Mama isn't the most reliable of narrators, right? And if that is the case, should we then reconsider Walker's decision? Is Walker actually telling us to sort of question her decision to give the quilts to Maggie, right? So Mama says, well, Dee is gonna, she has the whole dream or this vision, right, about the talk show, and none of it is true, right? It's the way in which Mama has internalized Dee's sort of elevation in society. Any pushback there? No?
I have a question that is never totally said in the story, but Maggie and her mother have serious burns from fire, but we never know. And Dee was not around during that fire. We never know, was that a racist fire? We never. I assumed it was in the story, but I never know. It's never really pursued much further.
So if I remember correctly, Dee was present, because I think the fires, don't the fires happen when they're younger, if I'm not mistaken? Yeah, the fires happen when they're,
Yeah, Dee's present, and in fact, the mother thinks she's probably glad that the house is burning down.
Yeah, right. And Dee never says that, actually.
That's right.
Trying to remember what critics have said. So the burns on her skin, so once they've said, like, it represents the sort of the aggregate sum of just oppressive realities, right? That's what the house represents, and that's what the burns represent too. So I'm thinking, like, well, Maggie herself is a sort of an artifact. I mean, I don't want to objectify her in that sense, but like, she signifies this really thick history of this, this Southern family who's subjected to like all these different like oppressive realities, and she's supposed to represent having emerged from that, right? The aggregate sum of having emerged from, I'm sorry, she's the signified image of having emerged from these sort of aggregate oppressive realities. Or at least that's what critics have said.
Yeah, there's one critic who noticed a shift in verb tense in the story. It starts out very much in the present. We're here waiting for Dee to show up. And then there is that moment that shifts from present tense to past tense. And this might be a reflection on the Mama as the narrator. She says, Dee announces her name change, and then the mother says, what happened to Dee? I wanted to know. And suddenly all the story is in past tense from that point on. Now, some people have said that means the mother's kind of distancing herself, taking control of the story in a way by putting it in the past and distancing herself from Dee at that point. What do you think? So this is following up on ShaDawn's point about whether the mother is a completely reliable narrator. I don't think she's lying about stuff exactly, but she could be shading it by her view of Dee and maybe some resentment against Dee.
Yeah, I agree with that, where from the very beginning of the story, she kind of has some form of ambivalence towards Dee. And she's like proud of her success, but at the same time, she kind of sort of envies her ability to quote, like, looking anyone in the eye. And I would say that she's throughout the whole story sort of uncomfortable with her selfish nature.
Yeah, Dee can be obnoxious, but she does have confidence.
I think it could be some of like, she's hoping that when Dee comes, it's going to be a nice meeting. Although she does say at the very beginning that like Maggie is not going to feel comfortable until Dee leaves. Like she's going to be uncomfortable that whole time. But I think the mom was kind of hoping that things would go better than they did go. And then at that moment, that was where she knew like, yeah, it's not gonna be a happy meeting. It's not gonna be nice. Like that's where it just changed. And so I don't know if there's more to it behind that, but
Yeah. I mean, I think Mama she herself elevates Dee to this like really mythic, godly stature, right? And so some critics have said like even as she's preparing for Dee, it's almost as if she's, you know, it falls within this sort of African tradition of ushering in the presence of an Orisha or God, right? So she's sweeping the yard and she's preparing for you know, this godlike figure to arrive, right? And it's very African, cosmological, and in that sense, right? And so if that's understood, right? If we concede that, then we have to also think about why it is, or whether it's true that it's Mama who's elevating Dee to this godlike status, right? And Dee comes. When she arrives, you know, of course that she's this totally different disposition, right? So she's dressed in African clothing. She has an African suitor, right? And, but she's very much so rooted in the material, right? In the material world. She wants the butter churn. She wants all these things to feel grounded to this past. And so in that sense, right, it's like Mama, you were tripping all along. Like you've turned her into this deity. You know what I mean? Anything else from everyday use?
So are we still giving the quilts to Maggie? Is that still the consensus of the group? I see heads nodding. Maggie's looking good for the quilts here.
Well, I'll ask you this, like, who's more likely, because the thing about quilting, there's also G's Bin, right? This community of women. This is a real community of women. Put it in the chat. I think it's G's, and I think they might be on this is the Gullah Islands, Gullah Geechee culture, Gee's Bend, I think, right? And so if we think about Gee's Bend and we think about the context in which quilts were created during slavery, and just like this very familial, like they're very familial, like tethering, right? They're supposed to be ensconced in this really communal like environment. Who is more likely to continue that tradition, right? Would that be Dee or would that be Maggie? Because if you think about the end of the story, Mama and Maggie like sort of reconnect. Like there's this like sort of restored intimacy between Dee and Maggie, and they retreat, right? It's just the two of them, right? Who's more likely to reestablish this sort of communal ethos surrounding the practice of quilting and to sort of place the quilts within that context? What do you think?
I don't think, I mean, I think Maggie and Mama might be by themselves a lot. Maggie can fix the quilts, but I don't think that Dee, when she takes it back to wherever she is, she's just gonna hang it up. And I don't think that it's going to be like, look at what my family made, look at how precious this is. Like, I think it's just gonna be like, see these pictures of my house and this is the work that my family makes, but it's not like a pride thing, not a heritage thing. It's more of like taking the Wangara name or whatever. Like it's not as meaningful. Like it's her just posing, like putting up this kind of front.
Yeah, I get the impression that Maggie knows how to do fiber arts and Dee doesn't. So she's not gonna be able to carry on that tradition. Maggie is the one that is more in tune with and can connect with that, kind of thing. It makes me, I never learned how to crochet or embroider or, quilt, although I have a quilt from my great-grandmother, but I never learned how to do that. And now it's like, why didn't somebody teach me how to do that? Why can't I carry on that kind of tradition? So.
Yeah. But she's also like a 20-year-old, right? Like this isn't like, she's not at the height of like who she's gonna become. And so I don't know, I'm just hoping that there's more redemption for Dee. If she goes to hang them up, right? They have superficial value right now, but we see the evolution of Dee, right? And possibly she'll get to a point where she realizes, well, I can't, how is it that I have done this work to learn my African heritage, right? But I've just, in the process, I've disassociated myself from my immediate African-American traditions. Maybe I need to actually go back and learn where I'm from, right? I need to really learn the tradition of my name. I can start with the quilts that's been hanging up for 2 years, right? I mean, that's idealistic, but.
Well, and if I think that's an important way to look at it. And if you think about Walker herself, she didn't go back and live with her mother on the farm. She came out of there and wrote stories about it. The stories that based on the stories her mother told her. But if nobody does that, you've still got Maggie and her mother kind of isolated back there. And
John, it looks like you froze again. Are we ready to kind of move on to the number 3 question about Elethia? How do you say Elethia?
Elethia.
Elethia, thank you. Elethia.
Before you move on to the question, I had seen, and thank goodness for the way that you presented these things. In Elethia, she speaks a lot about presenting of minority populations as being taxidermy.
Mm.
Taxidermy is displaying prizes. That's what you do. You take animals, you say, I got the biggest animal, you put them in your tech, and you show them off. And I saw a direct connection between what Dee was doing with the quilts and the taxidermy. I mean, there's probably, and I read the stories in a different order, I might not have seen them. But
Oh, I like that.
I think there's a direct connection. It's just taxidermy to Dee. And that's shameful. I mean, it was like a prize. I can show this prize off. And of course, the sadness is in the other story is that these are people we're talking about, not quilts. But it's just taxidermy.
Yeah.
You know,
I would call it performative. I would call it a naive performativity.
Can you explain what you mean by that?
yeah, I don't.
Yeah. Yeah, so like, you know, we see it a lot of, you know, during Black History Month, the dashikis, and, you know, just like the reliving of African traditions that like, it's a distant past, right? That we can't retrieve, that many of us can't retrieve. And so in that sense, you're performing an identity, right, that you don't necessarily know. And it's a naivete because I think she's genuinely interested in reconnecting, right, historically to an African, to her African roots. But like in doing so, she has to, and Hansberry, Lorraine Hansberry was really good at identifying this as well. But like, I think it's more so of a performative naivete, but I do very much so like the connection between what she's doing with the quilts and taxidermy. So thanks for pointing that out though, Dan.
So I apologize for my my Wi-Fi going in and out here, but it sounds like we're shifting to the story of Elethia, and that's good. Why do you think Elethia carries around those ashes for her for the rest of her life, apparently, or at least the rest of what we know of her life in the story?
I kind of look at it as her way of making sure that this person, this ancestor of ours, has, you know, received some kind of dignity, because they weren't dignified and they didn't receive that respect and dignity taxidermied. But now I can, you know, kind of make sure that they are receiving that kind of respect if I, you know, take care of their mortal remains.
So it's an act of responsibility, accepting a burden.
I wouldn't call it a burden, I would say, but yeah, an act of responsibility.
Okay. Other ideas, other things that it might represent, or reasons she carries that carries those ashes with her. Well, think about the what the act was that created the ashes. What are they? What are they from? What did they do to the Uncle Albert figure in order to come up with these ashes?
They stole them,
Burned them.
burned them, took them to the incendiary, schools incendiary.
Well,
I saw that there as like being honorable.
they not only stole them, but they stole them for and you know, burning can have a lot of different symbolisms, but they stored them to set them free, to put them into a fire that would consume the past and give to a future. I mean, maybe that's, I'm not going to try to say that's what her idea of the symbolism was, but the fire was a purifying thing. The ashes became purified from the bodies became purified by being turned to ashes. That's the way I viewed it, but it could be, you know, that symbolism does not have to be the only one that could be used in this.
Now, symbols by their nature suggest all sorts of things. So, anybody see any other significance to the burning of the mummified Uncle Albert?
I think it was partly just so that nobody could use him again in a way that was so undignified and so degrading.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it could have something to do with making sure that the right people are controlling the narratives, and that she continues to demystify misrepresentations of Black people and other marginalized groups, right? Because, you know, she mentions, you know, the Indian, and I think, I'm guessing they were like Native American like statues in these museums.
Yeah, I almost saw it as kind of maybe I don't know how to say this, but like a reverse lynching, taking the body, consecrating it, you know, instead of just doing something good with fire, just trying to redeem this awful symbol.
Yeah, and since fire was used so many times in lynchings, I think it is an attempt to reverse that process and use it to liberate Uncle Albert.
It makes me think too of she writes about returning home and returning home to dilapidated structures, right? And she talks about Flannery O'Connor's home, right? And how it's like in pristine shape, even posthumously. And it makes me think of this notion of like white supremacy and white privilege are still afforded white folks, even posthumously, right? Whereas her home represents, you know, disinheritance, right? And so how then do I honor and consecrate the life of this Black man, right, after his death in ways that run counter to what he was, you know, just what he was subjected to, right, to this sort of process of exhibition and taxidermy.
And apparently Albert really was a person with a lot of dignity, and a person who, when he was alive, was not willing to be used or manipulated by the white supremacists around him.
Yeah, yeah. I found that part of the story, I think, the most provocative.
And it's a good example, I think, for Walker's idea of not forgetting the past, of really learning what was really going on in the past, and remembering that figure she remembered from her own past, from when she was a kid. And there was that restaurant in Eatonton where they had the stuffed Uncle Remus figure in the window. And of course, it was a restaurant where Black people were allowed to work in the kitchen, but not to eat in the restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Uncle Remus figure, again, talking about the real stories or finding the story. Joel Chandler Harris's version of those stories, it's a lot different. And what's been made of that by like the Walt Disney movie Song of the South back in the 1940s, what's been made of Uncle Remus, as well as what the character was, undercut very much by Charles Chestnut and other writers who have shown a more honest view of what somebody in Uncle Remus's position would have been thinking and saying.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. close to the end of that about where it says she was disheartened to find Uncle Albert's in her textbooks, in the newspapers, and on TV. And I was thinking like about how that connects to like the idea of Uncle Tom and the idea of like kind of those two faces that we see in like a lot of writing. And so I don't know what you had said earlier about why does she carry it around with her? I think, you know, she says, but she had her jar of ashes, the old timers' memories written down, and her friends who wrote that in the army, they were learning skills, like all this, like she's not letting herself be used in that way. Like those ashes kind of remind her of like, you're not there for people to make you into what they want you to be type.
Yes, good point. Good point. That is a very good point, right? So what I think what's interesting is that the image that we get of Albert is totally is the exact opposite of like who he actually was in real life, right? So Walker, in a very like, I don't know, it's a very short story, right? But she creates this really impressive you've got the smiling caricature image, right, of the Black man who actually didn't even have teeth, right,
Mhm.
because of his resistant, you know, his resistant disposition, right, and he was recalcitrant, and he believed in bodily autonomy, right, but they portray him in a very different way, and it really made me think of like the paradigm of this sort of post-mortem return to this racially inferior state, right? So yes, you were this resistant enslaved man, you were recalcitrant, right? And you challenged white power structures, right? But that's an unnatural image. And in order for us to sort of reinstate a racial hierarchy, I have to sort of, in your death, I have to return you to your natural state, right? So which is this inferior, grinning darky, which reestablishes a racial hierarchy. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and a lot's been written by critics about messages about the Black body being turned into a message of white supremacy, a message of the kind of white dominance that you're talking about here. There's a similar scene in the novel Meridian very early where a guy's wife is sort of mummified in a way and put on display. And I think also of somebody like Setha in Beloved, which we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks, the tree on her back, all those scars from the beating were a message.
Oh, yeah, reminds me of Maggie too.
Yeah, Maggie, another carrying those scars.
Good point.
So power structures like to take bodies and turn them into texts, into messages to other people to stay in line, to accept whatever role has been set out for them.
Except the Black people, right? I think for them, they're happy that, so they see the political, this is gonna sound crazy, but they see the political utility in his objectification, in his taxidermy, right? They're like, well, at least he has access to this space that we don't have access to. Which is interesting, right? Because what it also reminds me of is the limits of social ascendancy and the limits of social mobility. He has access to this space, but only insofar as it allows him, it allows like the power structure to again reestablish a racial hierarchy. I wonder if Walker knew of or drew it all from the case, this cases of this Nigerian man Solomon, who was stolen and sold into slavery during the 18th century, during the 18th century Spanish slave trade, right? So he was sold to this emperor or the governor of Sicily, and then sold again, and he became this court Moor, what's called a court Moor, right? Court more in aristocratic Vienna society. And then he rose to prominence. He was a Freemason. He was an educator. And he married a wealthy Viennese woman, right? As a servant in the royal court. And then when he died of a heart attack, his daughter, who fought with the Catholic Church to for everyone, no matter their race or creed, to have fair burials, she tried to retrieve his body, and they didn't allow her to retrieve his body. In fact, they sold him to the Museum of Natural History, and he was taxidermized as well. So I don't know if you all heard that story as well. So anyway, so he's not afforded a proper burial, but he's accepted, right? He's allowed to assimilate into the society, right? But then after his death, he's returned to his natural state, right? So they place him in this container. They place him in all of these exotic clothing, right? And he's surrounded by all these exotic animals. His name is Solomon. He's a Nigerian man. It was the 18th century. And he's placed on exhibit, right? In a museum of natural history. And it just, for me, it just, again, the paradigm is similar insofar as we have to sort of think about what are the limits of social ascendancy, right? Here's this man, right, Albert, who has, although posthumously, right, he has access to this white space, this restaurant, right, in ways that, like, the Black folks in the town do not, unless they are serving salads, right? But only insofar as it allows him to, allows them to really to define white identity, right? And yeah. So I wonder if she was drawing from this case at all as well. Let's find my.
But if I can, on taxidermy, with animals anyway, there's when you save an animal that way, when you display an animal that way, you are elevating the animal, for one thing. You're elevating, you're saying, this is the best. This was something I'm displaying because I took it, but it was something that was the best. So when they were put on display, and saying they were elevated at the same time. So it's complicated with the elevation of the individual that has been stuffed and put on display, because you pick that individual because they were the ones that were the best, the ones that you really wanted to show off, and you wanted to keep them and own them. That's what the people who display animals this way, this is what I got the best. So there is he's displayed because he is the best.
Yeah, but his heroism is not what's on display, right? So like his resolve to challenge the power structure, that's not what's on display, right? It's his subservience.
Yeah.
Well, and not Solomon, but I'm talking about like in Albert's case, right? It's just his subservience that's on display. In much the same way, like we refuse to really highlight the true Tom, right, in Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? So we don't want to place on display, or we didn't, right, in dramatized versions in the early 20th century, his heroism, right? It's only the caricature image of him, right, that's disseminated widely, right, throughout popular culture, right, and within the popular imaginary.
Yeah, I thought in his case it was less about that he's the best, and it's more like he stood up against us all this time, but we've got the last word. We've been able to make him into what we want to make him.
And maybe it's a warning to those people who take some pleasure in the fact that at least he got into the restaurant, to be wary of tokenism and of enjoying feeling like you've really won when you really haven't.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like the fact that he's being put on display, as he said, it right in front of the gleaming window, it's more of a sign of saying that you're more than welcome to come into this restaurant, but you have to be put into the white man, in this case, where they want you to be put in. And in this case, for for Albert, they taxidermied him and they just put him out as basically carrying this tray, being a worker.
Yeah, because he's supposed to be carrying a tray. He's allowed to appear as a servant, as a server, but certainly not as a customer.
Yeah, just for me, it just reiterates just how important Black bodies are to the construction of white identity. Right, this dialectical relationship is just so cemented.
All right, so it is not quite 8:15, but I just want to be cognizant of time. So do you want to look at or talk about, we've already kind of started talking a little bit about the last question. Do you want to reiterate or build on that, or do a kind of summary thing, or? I'm talking to ShaDawn and John, and if you want to do any kind of summary or in cap or anything, or look more specifically at that last question, which really, I mean, you know, Uncle Tom is a good example of, you know, people don't know him as he was written in the book because people haven't read the book. They only know about the caricature play version of him.
All the Tom shows that we talked about several years ago, and the movies and the paraphernalia, the gear, all that stuff. Well, I'll talk a little bit about that last question, and then let ShaDawn have the last word. It seems to me that yes, I think the reevaluation of Uncle Tom's Cabin that's happened in the past, well, since the late 1970s, when Jane Tompkins started the revival, is a good indication of the need to look low as well as high, because Uncle Tom's Cabin was low culture, so low that I've said this before, that I didn't even read it when I went through my PhD exams in 19th century American Lit. I had not read Uncle Tom's Cabin until after the revival happened starting in the late 70s, when Tompkins wrote that very important, very influential essay saying, hey, we should look at the cultural work the book does, not just that it doesn't conform to certain formal standards by which we judge great literature. Again, question the standards, not necessarily the works that are making a claim to be than they have been. So we still have to read it with very critical eyes, but not simply to dismiss it as sentimental, or because it's so popular, because it was so popular. I remember when I started teaching, I foolishly was taught to teach a distinction between serious and popular fiction. Serious fiction was written by people like Joseph Conrad and William Faulkner and people like that, and popular fiction was just junk. We just didn't want to pay attention to it. Well, obviously, that's a false dichotomy. If we got rid of popular literature, we'd have to drop Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, and plenty of other people who are in the literary canon already. So I learned some lessons from that, and I think the death and rebirth of Uncle Tom's Cabin is a good example of that too. The need to question your standards for greatness and your what you're looking for when you look at when you evaluate a work. So now over to ShaDawn.
I don't know how to follow behind that, but I'll just say that I don't think that Uncle Tom will ever be afforded, right? I think what we saw happen with Albert, right? So I don't think that demythologizing is ever going to happen. I think that he cemented in a really artifact-like way, right? If we're sort of tying in the quilt, and the American imaginary, right? In a really misrepresented way. And I think that it's really hard to sort of undo a cultural lexicon, right? It becomes sort of cemented, right? We can't just snatch him out of that out of that, you know, that cultural lexicon and place him in the incinerator and recreate the image of Uncle Tom, right? And retell that story and expose the heroism of Uncle Tom in the way that Walker was able to do with Albert, right? And that's unfortunate, because I actually know some other folks who are more Uncle Tomish than Uncle Tom. And that's my piece.
All right. Well, thank you all again for an interesting and stimulating discussion tonight. And make sure you go back to our website and check all the great events coming up. And if you ever have any questions, you know, you can email me directly and we'll get them answered. So thank you all for coming. On behalf of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, ShaDawn, and thanks to everybody.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
all. You all very much.